Chapter 8 of the text deals with language in speech communication. We've looked at the first one, and that is characteristics of spoken language. Now we're looking at guidelines for language and style. So one of the key differentiations to note is that between denotation and connotation. So denotation is the literal dictionary definition of a word. Connotation, on the other hand, is that personalized meaning. It's what you ascribe in terms of meaning to a word, and that's based on your personal experience, your education, the groups that you affiliate with, all those things in your past, and your experiences with that particular concept is the connotation of the word. So if I said a dog bit me, of course, we know what a dog means. A dog, the dictionary definition, is a four-legged canine. But I'm not giving you enough information. And so if I don't give you enough information, you're going to fill in the rest with your own meaning. So your connotation for dog might be a bull terrier, or it might be a chihuahua, or you just don't know. And where did it bite me? You might think it bit me on the leg, or it bit me somewhere else. So the less information you give, the less descriptive you are, the more you allow the audience to control the meaning. So in order to control the connotation of what the audience comes up with in terms of that idea, you certainly have to be very descriptive, very concrete, rather than being very abstract. So another way of differentiating between denotative and connotative meanings, if you think of the American flag, can be described denotatively by its color and design. But connotatively, it's the meaning that we have as a symbol of freedom and democracy. Now remember that other people don't see the American flag that way, and they may view it as a symbol of Western imperialism. All right. So you have to be concrete and use concrete language that's rooted in real life so that we can see and we can hear and taste and touch. And one good example of that is MLK's I Have a Dream speech. So let me read just a few excerpts from it to let you know how he uses concrete speech. So he says, "This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope." Notice that image. To millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. Seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak. Notice the pictures, the images that he evokes. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty, in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, in fact, he will use the phrase 100 years later at the beginning, kind of like anaphora, to introduce each statement. So where is the Negro? The Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself an exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. We've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. He goes on. He says, "And we refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. We need to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood." He says, "But there is something I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities." Just some examples from MLK's I Have a Dream speech, in which he uses concrete language to describe so that we can see, hear, and taste the experiences that the Negro people, as he says, were experiencing in his day. So concrete words and phrases create pictures in listeners' minds. It creates an emotional response in listeners because it paints a very vivid picture, allowing the audience to imagine the situation on a more emotional level. The difference between active voice and passive voice, and generally we want to use the active voice where the subject does the action. I kicked the ball, Messi scored the goal, versus the goal was scored by Messi. What's more powerful is the active voice, but there are times when you prefer the passive voice because it creates a shift in the tone of your message. The example that we often use is rules are meant to be broken. We leave out the subject because the subject is not the focus, it's the fact that rules ought to be broken. A key word or phrase can reappear throughout your speech to reinforce your theme. Martin Luther King does this often. Each time the image is repeated, it becomes more powerful and is more likely to stay with your listeners. Imagery involves creating a vivid description, as MLK does, through the use of one or more of our five senses. And metaphors are when you compare something to something else. And I asked you to use a metaphor for your Who Am I Really presentation. So Bill Clinton used one very effectively when he said, our democracy must not only be the envy of the world, but also the engine of our renewal. Similes are very similar to metaphors, but they use the word like or as. Alliteration is the repetition of the initial consonant or initial sounds in a series of words. So MLK's I Have a Dream speech, where he says, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. Antithesis is the use of contrast within a parallel grammatical structure. Jesse Jackson used one that's very effective. We cannot be what we ought to be if we push dope in our veins rather than hope in our brains. Ascendanton is the deliberate omission of conjunctions between a series of related clauses. So often you hear the expression, I came, I saw, I conquered, rather than I came, then I saw, and finally I conquered. Personification involves investing human qualities in abstractions or inanimate objects, either through metaphor, simile, or analogy. And so we say the wind howls at us. You certainly want to use humor, and use humor with care. Well, humor enhances the speaker's image by improving the audience perception of the speaker's character. And it makes a speech more memorable and easy to listen to. Research shows that speakers who make themselves the object of the humor, laugh at themselves, often endear themselves to their listeners. So when you make jokes, making it your own expense is far better than making it the expense of someone else. Making a joke at the expense of someone else is really in poor taste. So find humor in your own experiences. Racial, ethnic, or sexist jokes are rarely acceptable. We'll get to language pitfalls in the next section.